Do I got to do that again? With gusto, my friends, with gusto. Happy Rotary morning. So glad to have all of you with us. For those I have not met before, my name is Cindy Peterson. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please remain standing while I invite Ron Melke to do our invocation.
Would you please bow your heads and pray with me? Our Father, we come to you today to thank you for this opportunity to gather as fellow Rotarians and guests, and to be able to renew old friendships or to make a new friend. We ask you to be with Senator John Thune and all of our elected federal and state leaders as they deliberate and legislate all the laws that govern our great nation and state. We thank you for the privilege to live in the greatest and freest nation in the world, and in a state that allows us to enjoy an abundance of freedom. As we approach Independence Day next Monday, we are reminded that freedom is not free, and many of our citizens have sacrificed much over the history of our nation to help preserve the freedoms we all enjoy today. We especially ask you to be with the citizens of Ukraine who are sacrificing much to preserve the freedoms they have come to appreciate. Help all of us to remember as we go about our daily lives to put into practice the Rotary four-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? We ask you to bless this food we have today to the betterment of our bodies and to assist all of us in finding ways to improve the quality of life in our community, our state, and the United States of America. Amen.
I'd like to thank our greeters today. We have kept them busy with a very full room and a number of guests. We do not have time to introduce each guest, but we are glad that you are here. I would like each of our guests to stand and the person who invited them to stand alongside their guest. Well, that's fun. Thank you all for being here. We have a new member induction, which is something we have been able to do at nearly each of our meetings this year as we are capping over 45 new members. And our friend Laura Mitchell is here to introduce our latest. Welcome.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm excited to welcome Christy Aberson as our newest member of Downtown Rotary. I got to know Christy about 15 years ago through Lawrence and Schiller, through some mutual friends, and have gotten to just grow in our relationship over the last several years recently. She works alongside my husband at what was formerly Great Western Bank, now First Interstate Bank, and leads their private banking area of offering there. So with that, I will welcome Christy up to the stage. So please help me welcome her to Rotary.
Hello, Laura. Thank you. I've gotten to spend a lot of time with the Mitchells, as she said, that I work with Jay at First Interstate Bank. I just have to say that Sioux Falls has always had my heart. From a Robert Frost Roadrunner to an Augustana Viking, Sioux Falls has always been home. I've had the privilege of studying abroad in Europe while at Augustana, and shortly after graduating, my husband Josh and I moved to Arizona and then California. We quickly realized we had left a wonderful place of Sioux Falls and moved back in 2009. We since then have lived downtown. We started a business downtown and now have 3 children, 5, 8, and 10, and a beloved dog, Tito. I've held a career in banking and finance for over 15 years. As Laura said, I'm currently vice president of private banking at First Interstate Bank. And so why Rotary? I've been involved with Realtors for Kids, Sioux Falls YPN, local nonprofit Breathe Bravely, and most recently, the finance committee at the Country Club of Sioux Falls, and a life group leader at my beloved church, Celebrate. I've always looked up to and respected Rotary for its service, its knowledge, and its members, and I'm thrilled and honored to be part of this community. Thank you.
Christy, we welcome you to Downtown Rotary, and I hope that we find wonderful ways to engage you in the next years to come. We have U.S. Senator John Thune with us today. Senator Thune, you have been a tremendous friend to Downtown Rotary. We're grateful that you're here today, and we look forward to learning a great deal from you. Downtown Rotarian and past President Joel Dykstra, the program's yours.
Thank you, Cindy. Senator.
Joel.
Welcome to Downtown Rotary.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
You know, I've been joking with people that I couldn't think of anything that we could talk about today, but I don't think that's the case. And I'm tempted to kind of jump right into the tough stuff, but this being South Dakota and this being a room full of friends, I really wanted to get an update from you on your family and on how everybody's doing, what they're doing, and what's going on the personal side.
Well, thank you, Joel. I'm trying to figure out where that hum is coming from, but it's great to be back at Downtown Rotary and with so many friends and faces and people that I've known and seen and worked with throughout the years. Grateful for the role that Rotary plays, not only in this community, but nationally around the world. But I was told earlier today that this is one of the biggest Rotary groups, literally globally, which says a lot, speaks, I think, loudly to the character of the people here, their willingness to roll up their sleeves and be involved in their community and make it a better place to work and to live and raise families. And so thank you for that. Thank you for your many contributions to Sioux Falls and surrounding area. And we are very blessed to be here in South Dakota. And there's so many neat things going on. So you all are deserve the credit for that. Yeah, just on a personal level, Kimberly and I are going on 38 years of marriage. We live in the same house we've lived in on the west side of Sioux Falls now for 24 years. And of course, she, as you know, I think grew up on a farm near Dolan, South Dakota. I'm originally from Murdo. We got a class reunion out there in 2 weeks. Not a class reunion, it's an all school. So I'll be out checking that out. And you know, our daughters both live here in Sioux Falls, which is great because we now have 5 grandkids. Brittany has 2, Larissa has 3. They run, I used to say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, but one of them just turned 2. So we've got 5, 4, 3, 2, 2. But we had one of them over the weekend, 2-year-old. That was a load. But it's great, and we feel very blessed and privileged to be able to have the kids close by because it just enriches our lives, and you have a chance to see and have influence on it. I tell people, my wife Kimberly did a great job raising our 2 daughters. I was there, but she did the heavy lifting, and I'm just so grateful that she has an opportunity to provide that same influence now with 3 granddaughters. And we have 3 granddaughters, 2 grandsons, but as you might expect, she's a little bit more partial to the granddaughters. And they're just a blessing to have around. So I continue to go back and forth, 35 to 40 weeks a year. We keep our primary residence here in South Dakota, which keeps us really grounded. Both the girls Brittany is currently working. She's got a job. She works from home, which is nice. And Larissa does, she's got the 3 kids, so she kind of quit working full-time. She was doing marketing for the University of Sioux Falls, but she's now doing some stuff from the home too. So both of them are busy and active.
Good, great. It's a new world, certainly from when you started the advent, the involvement of social media has made a lot of changes, and occasionally I have braved into the comments section on some of the things that you posted or have been posted on your behalf. And I just, how does your family deal with the hate, the venom, the kinds of comments or things that are attracted by nice pictures of you and the grandkids?
Yeah, it's kind of brutal out there. You just have to have kind of a thick skin. And honestly, there's so much stuff and social media has transformed politics since the time I got in. I mean, it really has. And and particularly now, a lot of these social media platforms there are algorithms that are used to manipulate the content that you see the day that you see. And so typically what happens is you get on a site and the algorithms kick in, and so they feed you more and more of the same, and you get into these bubbles. And so people nowadays, they get information sometimes from one source, and oftentimes a source where the content that they're seeing is being manipulated by an opaque algorithm. And so, you have to, I guess, take into perspective that there's a lot of frustration out there, and people now have a platform in which to vent that and accept it kind of as part of the doing business in politics. But I will tell you, I mean, for some of it too, and we post on most platforms because that's where a lot of people get their information. And Twitter, in particular, is a platform where a lot of the media resides. And so, if you want to put a message out, you have to be on Twitter. But I just don't read stuff much. In fact, I've been, as of I think next week, I'll have been Twitter free for 2 years. So, yeah, I'm out of the closet. But I just think that and it's not that I don't care, as I do, what people say, but so much of the content on there, the real sort of nasty stuff, it's just not. There's no real point really in if you're not going to engage in it, to just kind of let it pull you down. So I sort of decided that that made some sense, and I just allow that stuff. I just kind of tune it out, honestly. And a lot of it's troll driven too. There's a lot of stuff out there now that isn't real. And it's hard to differentiate which is and which isn't real. So sometimes it's better just to tune it out.
Yeah. And we recently had a primary election. Congratulations on the results of that, where you get some pretty direct feedback from the people who actually live in South Dakota. But let's see, this was your third re-election campaign?
This will be for the Senate fourth now.
Yeah, fourth term.
Fourth term, third re-election.
Third
correct,
re-election.
Third re-election, yes. Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
That's good,
And I don't
good
remember-
math, Joel.
Yeah, and I don't, well, okay, so help me with this one. How many times have you had a primary opponent?
Well, this was my second time. My first primary was in 1996, my first campaign for the House of Representatives. And it's unusual, for sure. But I think it's suggestive of what's happening out there. There is, like I said, there's a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. People kind of want to, they're sort of against the quote establishment. They want to take it out on what they perceive to be the status quo. And if you're in office today, you kind of represent that. So, yeah, we had a primary, and I understand it's a free country, and anybody who wants to run for office, they should. I encourage that. So, I think I ran my first TV ad in 18 years. I haven't run a TV ad since November of 2004. So we ran some TV ads, which you probably were sick and tired of by the end of the primary campaign, leading up to it. And I think, again, it's just a recognition that this is a different time. The mood out there is different. There's a lot of churn in the electorate today. Has to do with a lot of different issues, but if you're considered to be a part of the quote establishment, you're going to be a target of that. And so it's just something you have to accept and deal with, and understand that in a democracy, people have lots of different ways of expressing their views, and one of them is at the ballot box. And if somebody collects the signatures in South Dakota to run for office, then more power to them.
So you had a very healthy win, a healthy margin, more than 70%. But that obviously means that 27% of the people were voting for somebody else. As you get out there, as you actually talk to people, what are they mad about?
Well, yeah, I mean, you got almost a third of the people, 30% basically, that have said that we don't like the job you're doing, we want to have somebody else do it.
By the way, that's not a very dominant number.
Well,
You know,
it's a noticeable number. But I just think that a lot of it has to do with the sense that the country's kind of moving past people and sort of out of control. And I think too, complicated by the fact that most people, most voters at least, and particularly a lot of, you get in rural areas of South Dakota, don't trust a distant bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., and institutions generally. And I've seen a sort of a degradation in the confidence and trust that people have in institutions, particularly at the federal level. And so I think in a lot of ways, the primary votes that were held this year, not only here in South Dakota, but other places around the country, were a reflection of that. Just cynicism, sort of disenfranchisement, I guess you would say. And even though you work hard at connecting with people, and I'm back here all the time, I live here, whenever Congress isn't in session, I'm in South Dakota moving around the state somewhere. And you'd like to think that that helps with that sense that people have, but I just think it's very real. And it's tangible out there. You can feel it. I mean, people, when they come up to you on the street, you can feel it.
yeah, I do know that as talking to people, there's sometimes you get sound bites from people, but when you really probe and say, well, what do you think should be different, or what do you think senators should be doing differently? They're not really all that sure. They've just heard stuff, and maybe they got emails or they got something.
Yeah, I mean, again, a lot of it has to do with how people get information, where they get information, and sort of what the source of that is. Because if you're just constantly hearing one side of the story, you're probably going to come to that conclusion. And when people ask me, how can we improve the civility in public life today, my answer always is, well, diversify your sources of information. Start listening to what the other side is saying too, because I think that you've got to try and put yourself in the other person's position. And but to your point, I mean, yeah, you can get accosted lots of different places. Sometimes with my wife, where people come up and are just very, very animated, very hostile, and it's kind of become part of doing this job, and just one that you have to accept, and again, not personalize it, but recognize that there's just a lot of frustration out there.
Well, let's move into some of the issues, and we might as well kind of hit the high point first. I mean, last Friday we saw the Supreme Court decision, finally, the official Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade, overturning the decision that the Supreme Court made in 49 years and 5 months ago. So how do you think that decision is going to impact the abortion debate in the country?
Well, honestly, what it will do is it will put it back in the forum of the people and their elected representatives, which is where it was prior to 1973 when the court issued that decision in the first place. But so I think what's going to happen is you're probably going to see in states around the country a lot of pretty spirited debates about this issue, and people will find consensus on it, which is how a democratic process typically would work. I think what probably ultimately happens, although it won't happen overnight, is the pressure is going to build because states are going to do things differently, and the pressure is going to build for a national solution. Both sides will be engaged in that, and you will see both parties in Congress. And honestly, it's become almost a party line issue, really. I mean, there are people in both parties who have a different view on that, but there's only one senator right now on the Democrat side who I would consider to be a pro-life senator who votes that way, and even on this issue, he would vote to codify Roe. So I just think it's become kind of a party line issue, meaning that in a Senate that's 50-50, it's going to be very hard to get consensus on anything in a place where it takes 60 votes. So it'll take 60 in the Senate to pass any change at the federal level, codify anything, but it won't stop the votes from happening. I think both sides will probably try and find what they think is the right solution. If you look at it, 47 out of 50 European nations have restrictions after 15 weeks. There are none of them. I mean, we're among the most. We're only one of 7 countries in the world, including China and North Korea, that allow late-term abortions. Now, what sometimes I think people overreact, and when the draft opinion came out, the Democrats in the Senate immediately put a bill on the floor that not only, they used it, they said codified Roe, but not only did it codify Roe, it actually allowed for abortions right up to the point of birth. And secondly, it did away with all the state restrictions, and there are about 535 restrictions across the country that states have put on that are legal under Roe. It did away with the ban on taxpayer-financed abortions, which has been in place for 40 years. And it also did away with the religious exemption that providers can claim if they don't want to, doctors and nurses don't want to be a part of providing abortion. So it went, I mean, that was really extreme. In fact, so much so that it lost, we have 2 on our side who would vote to codify Roe on the Republican side, and it lost 1 Democrat who, as I said, would also vote to codify Roe because it went so far. So I guess what I'm saying is the Senate's 50-50. It'll take 60 to do anything, and which means there's going to have to be an effort nationally to find a consensus about something that will get 60 votes. And I think that the Dobbs 15-week threshold was one where if you talk, if you look at polls and that sort of thing, it's pretty overwhelmingly in support that when a baby feels pain, that's when people start saying, okay, something needs to be done. And that right now is about 15 weeks, which is why a lot of the laws that you see start there. We have a Pain-Capable Unborn Protection Act, a Lindsey Graham bill that's at 20 weeks that's been introduced, and we voted on that a time or two. But I think both sides at the federal level will be engaged and their constituencies trying to get some sort of a federal solution. But I think in the near term, what you're going to see happen is debates in states all across the country, and states will adopt different statutes.
You mentioned the leaked draft. Haven't seen that now for a couple of months and haven't had some time to talk about that. Do you think that leak does lasting damage to the Supreme Court?
Well, it's not. Yes. I mean, I think if that became the norm, they're still trying to nail down how it happened, where it came from. There's an investigation at the court underway to determine that. We have in the Senate on our side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle, we have 3 senators who clerked on the Supreme Court, and so all of them are pretty familiar with how the process works. Who, most of them believe that it was a clerk that leaked it, a law clerk. But who knows until the investigation, until there's a conclusion. But I think that you don't want to do anything that undermines the independence of the judiciary, because obviously the political branches of our government, the legislative branch, the executive branch, the founders designed them to be independent and to act in a way that wasn't subject to the norms of political debate. They're there to be the referees, the umpires, to call balls and strikes, to apply the Constitution and the law in an impartial way. And so anything that taints or provides or gives a perception out there among people that the court is being in any way politicized, I think is harmful to it, yeah.
Well, let's move to another topic. Everybody knows that the southern border is a disastrous situation. I'm not always that happy about the northern border, but we'll just take that aside for a minute. Yeah, well, it's clearly the problem at the southern border is worse than it's been in a long time, but it has also been really bad for a long time through multiple administrations, through and besides just going to the details of the issue, it brings up another topic, which I've heard from I've heard said that the two parties they actually prefer to have the issue than to have a solution. Is that the case? Is there something in Congress that could actually get done that might help that situation? What is the core issue with immigration?
I think just because you can't do everything doesn't mean you shouldn't do something. And there are things on which there's agreement. But the challenge is the holy grail for Democrats is citizenship for people who are here illegally. The holy grail for Republicans is build the wall, enforce the border, border security. And so neither side is willing to accept what could be done that could be found in the middle, because both sides are dug in for, quote, a comprehensive solution. And a comprehensive solution in this day and age in Congress is hard to get to. I think the situation is bad enough down there right now that there's an opportunity, and I would say this probably doesn't happen unless we get the majorities back in the Congress, in a divided government, to try and find some common ground on this. Because, last month of May, was the worst month in history. 234,000 people attempted illegal crossings. And unfortunately, a lot of it is, you can look back at specific policy decisions that were made, and you can see results and outcomes from those policy decisions. And when President Biden took office, they basically canceled the border wall. He rescinded the emergency order that had been declared at the border, quit enforcing a lot of the immigration laws, reduced the number of deportations, and ended the Remain in Mexico policy. And they were all decisions, they were policy decisions that were made, which the Border Patrol people, and I have talked with the Border Patrol people, and they said they warned them, you do this, this will happen. You do this, this will happen. And so it's essentially now kind of gotten this green light welcome sign at the southern border. And, as a consequence of that, people are flocking across. And when they get here, we don't have the capacity to be able to adjudicate their cases. Many cases, if they're coming here for asylum, if they're claiming refugee status, they have to go through an adjudicatory process, which we don't have the capacity to do. So we release them and tell them to come back in 60 days or 90 days. Well, nobody does, and so once they're here illegally, in most cases, they're probably going to stay. I've always believed when it comes to the issue of immigration, we've got workforce issues in this country, and we're always fighting with the administration to get H-2B visas, especially this time of the year, just to fill positions so we can serve people in our travel industry, among others. But there are legal ways, whether it's a temporary work permit or some sort of thing that would allow people to come here to fill some of those jobs, but they got to be legal. And what gets lost in all this, and I'm one generation removed from immigrant status. My grandfather came here from Norway back in 1906. We are a country of immigrants, but we're first and foremost a country of laws, a nation of laws, and you got to follow the laws. So I've always said big wall, big gate. Build a wall to keep people from coming here illegally, but have a big gate that allows people to come through a legal avenue, particularly if we need them in the workforce. So there's a way to do this, but it'll mean everybody's not going to get everything they want. I think you can come up with a solution today that would provide a legal remedy for people to be here and work legally, short of citizenship, that you could probably get through and get majority support for. But like I said, that's not an acceptable solution, because Democrats want those who are here illegally to have citizenship.
Well, let's talk about energy. The recent increase in the price of gasoline has made everybody an expert in economics and supply and demand. Yes, I think there's a lot of agreement on some level. There's quite a lot of agreement that we need more production, and that would kind of been nice to have a pipeline. But there's a real refinery capacity issue in this country. And, you know, we have trouble building roads and bridges or getting new projects approved through EPA, through other agencies. I can't imagine how you'd get a new refinery built on a greenfield site in this country. So what do you think Congress can do to address these issues of gas supply and refinery capacity, or what can we do to actually lower the price of gasoline at the pump?
Well, a lot of it is, I mean, and you're right, there are lots of, we've all become experts on gas prices, but the truth of the matter is, I mean, it does start fundamentally with supply and demand. And, you know, prior to the pandemic, we were actually at a point where we were energy independent. We were producing more than we needed in this country. We were actually exporting energy for the first time in my lifetime. And again, you can point to specific decisions that were made, policy decisions that were made when the new administration came to power. You know, they took federal lands out of production. Look at Alaska, look at the Gulf. They quit issuing permits to drill. They put pressure on investors not to invest in certain sectors of the economy, predominantly oil and gas, although it trickles into other areas. That's not the full extent of it. And they killed a lot of infrastructure. I mean, our pipeline out here, the Keystone XL pipeline is a good example, but there's a huge pipeline, $3.5 billion investment that's 94% done that they've stopped down in the southeastern part of the United States. But you got to have infrastructure and you have to have refineries. And it's hard to get a refinery built because it takes so stinking long to get the approvals. The permitting process is so complicated. And as you pointed out, Joel, even on infrastructure projects, you know, this 85th Street interchange down here on the south end of town is stalled out. It's on EAs, yeah, environmental assessments. So these environmental impact studies that have to be done on all these projects now drag on for 5-10 years. And it's just impossible to do big things, big infrastructure projects in this country in an expedited way. And so I think we have to figure out a way. And again, part of it is it's different philosophies and views that administrations come to power that they have. But I think, you know, from a congressional point of view, you know, we need to be looking at ways to authorize more, not less, energy production, because clearly gas prices today, even at almost $5 here in South Dakota or closer to $10 in California, isn't an acceptable solution. And there are a lot of people on the far left, on the progressive wing of the left, who believe that it doesn't matter how high the gas price goes. It's pushing people into electric vehicles. And I think that ultimately is kind of the goal in the energy policy the current administration has. But you could make specific decisions, changes today. It wouldn't happen overnight. It takes a while to implement them. But if you just go back to some of these policies that I talked about earlier, I don't understand why. For example, in the 2017 Tax Act, we authorized exploration in Alaska on the North Slope, and the 2 Alaska senators have fought hard for that. And now all of a sudden, it's like they're off limits. And you know, we've got resources in this country, and I'm fine with electric vehicles. You want an electric vehicle, more power to you. It's a free country. In fact, I encourage that, and I encourage liquid fuels like biofuels, which can also help diversify you know, our supply in this country, because we're big producers of biofuels here in South Dakota and the Midwest. That's part of the solution. But you can't deny that the solution long-term in this country to energy doesn't consist of and include liquid fuels. We can't get to electric overnight. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the grid capacity. We don't have the batteries. And the rare earth minerals that it takes to make the batteries. That stuff just hasn't been thought through. What we do know works, and we need more of that until we get this other thing figured out. But right now, we need liquid fuels, and we have them here in the United States. We can get at it. You want to do something to affect gas prices, even changing the signals that are being sent out there to the investment community would have a profound impact on what's happening, because these ESG rules and philosophy that are permeating out of the administration and their regulators are putting intense pressure I talk to people all the time, equity fund, Wall Street bankers, investment bankers, who basically now have to run every one of these decisions past their ESG board to determine whether or not they can make an investment. And I've even seen in South Dakota, ag banks and credit unions are concerned now that the logical extension of this is another sector they're worried about is agricultural loans, because livestock production generates methane. And so in the initial annual report that the regulator for the credit unions in this country put out, their 5-year thing, they basically targeted agricultural productions as an area where they're going to discourage investment. And so this thing, if it's carried out to its logical conclusion, starts sweeping a really, painting a wide brush across a lot of sectors of the economy, all of which are very important to our growth.
Let's talk about renewables for a minute. We've got a fair amount of wind power in South Dakota, though not in Lincoln County. But we do have the potential, I suppose, to have some solar power. But I never hear anybody talking about how much fossil fuel energy it takes to build an electric car, or a wind tower, for that matter, or move it across the country. So, and on top of that, back to the other issue of environmental permitting, those rare earth minerals. We're not going to get approval for a new mine. So those things are all issues that get in the way of some of these dreams about renewable fuels. But what is Congress doing? What can we see? What can we expect down the road for electric vehicles and renewable power that will affect South Dakota?
Well, I think that in our state's been a great leader. Governor Dugard here always says that 83% of the power we generate in South Dakota is renewable. It's hydro, it's wind, of course, biofuel. So we have been sort of at the forefront, I think, of when it comes to production. I think in terms of what does the future look like? Clearly we have the capability in a state like South Dakota to generate wind. Lord knows there's a lot of wind, and we grow a lot of products, and I think that can be converted into renewable energy. I think part of it is continuing to get the right signals out there, the right incentives for investment, and in some cases that's going to be infrastructure, because a lot of the refueling stations aren't capable or aren't equipped to do it. They've got to make that investment. There are incentives now for them to do that, and I'm always encouraged by what I see happening out there, but I think there's so much more that we could do. And the renewable fuel standard, which I was involved in getting passed both in 2005 and then the amendments to it in 2007, has worked pretty well, but making sure that it gets implemented the right way and that they're actually adhering to the law has been a challenge. And so we fought with administrations from both political parties through the years to make sure that they are actually enforcing the RFS and putting the right renewable volume obligations out there on an annual basis, not issuing these waivers to these refiners that claim that they're harmed, because most cases they haven't been. And so we've had to work with multiple administrations. It's really hard to get their attention. I mean, I've tried twice now to get a meeting with President Biden. I've told him I'll bring 12 senators down to meet with you about renewable fuels and to talk about the future and what are some of the things that we can do. And we got crickets. And I think part of it is their focus is EVs. It's electric vehicles. And electric vehicles and fuels are at odds, And so, the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, the Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, all of these folks are, I think, instructed basically to this is where we're headed. This is where our, energy policy in this country is going, and stay on that track. So it's been hard to get their attention. The one thing I will say has changed, and I meet all the time with, a lot of the CEOs of the different energy companies in the country, kind of through all the different energy forms. But the one thing I've seen is more of a conversation occurring in the liquid fuels world between the oil and gas guys and the renewables guys, because I think they see increasing the relevance of having a united liquid fuels versus the electric world. Because right now, at least for the next decade, that's probably what you're going to be looking at. So much so that, Chevron is making a $3 billion investment in Iowa. They're buying an ethanol company there. And I think you're going to see more of that. I hear that more from the oil and gas energy execs, that they're seeing more value in trying to team up in a way instead of fighting and trying to kill renewable fuels in this country, which is what we've been dealing with for the last 40 years, basically. They view them as a competitor, and now they're starting to view them, I think, in some ways as an ally. So I hope that's useful for the debates of the future.
Is there a future for nuclear power?
Yeah, I think there is. For all the reasons that people nowadays, green power, if you're worried about climate, it's a great solution. But again, so hard to get them built. So hard to get the permitting and everything else that goes with it.
All right, back to pricing, back to inflation. The multi-trillion-dollar spending of 2020 and 2021, is there a cause in there? Is that part of the cause for the current inflation? Is it all down to ARPA, or are there pieces of maybe the 2020 packages that have contributed to the money supply issues?
Well, I think that the 2020 crisis and everything that was done, and boy, I mean, people were freaked out at the time. I just remember that, and we stepped on it. But it was all done in a bipartisan way. I mean, all those bills that passed, the 5 bills that passed in 2020 that had additional spending, whether it was for, retail businesses, the PPP program, or any of the other many things that we were doing to support healthcare providers, and funding for PPE and funding for tests and vaccines, and all the stuff that was done, was done in a bipartisan way. What changed in January of 21 is they decided to push another bill through right after we passed one in December on a bipartisan basis. And they used the only procedure in the Senate that allows you to move a piece of legislation at 51 votes, which is budget reconciliation. And they passed another $2 trillion spending bill under the guise of COVID relief, but it was an expansion of government. And I just remember having this conversation. The chairman of the Federal Reserve had been in, Jerome Powell, and talking to him about concerns about money supply and, overstimulating the economy. Because I said, when I was in business school, money supply is something we paid attention to. Is that right, Jerry? And he's like, well, we don't really worry about that anymore. We've got tools. We've got tools to contain inflation. And I said, well, it just seems to me, because I looked at the growth of money supply year over year, a couple years there, and it was growing at 19, 20% a year. And I'm like, this isn't going to be sustainable. I mean, you're going to have flooded the zone with so much money out there. And he said, well, it's manageable. It won't be big. It'll be transitory. Well, now they're acknowledging it's not transitory. It is, and it is big. It's 8.5, 8.6%. So that is a real issue. And that's why we have been so insistent on trying to shut down this $5 trillion more that they wanted to spend, and successfully, at least so far, knock on wood, defeated that, although they're trying to resurrect at least pieces of it. And by the way, I tell people that one of the reasons that the Republicans need to get the majority in the Senate back in November is that so I can quit mowing Joe Manchin's lawn. Because
doesn't he live on a boat?
Yeah, or take the barnacles off his boat. But in a 50-50 Senate, we spend a lot of time, and thank God. I mean, so far, like I said, they're pushing hard again. The president's pushing them. The leadership's pushing them to do about $1 trillion in new taxes, 1 to 1.2 trillion, to pay for some new spending things they want to do. But I just think right now, any amount of massive infusion of dollars out there, coupled with tax increases, in an economy that's pretty wobbly. I mean, I think you're going to see probably when the second quarter GDP numbers come out that we may already be in a recession. That's defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. I think we may already be there. So flushing, another trillions of dollars out there, raising taxes, to me is just a prescription for further disaster. And so, but there is no question, to your original points, a long way to getting there, that when you have that kind of stimulus out there and that kind of demand out there, it just couldn't keep up with supply. And I think that was a big part of it. Now, supply chain issues, other issues, yeah, there's some things that affected that. But fundamentally, it's too many dollars chasing too few goods.
Let's look at the international side for a minute. War in Ukraine is dragging on. America seems to be getting more involved in some ways, sending weapons, training, humanitarian support. Are we headed for another long-term foreign engagement?
Well, the thing that's different about this, as opposed to both Iraq and Afghanistan, is that there are no American soldiers going in there. And yeah, we got a lot of blowback over the money that we sent to Ukraine, coupled with help from our NATO allies. But I think we have a really big stake in this. And the reason I say that, and I'm someone who grew up in the Cold War and the USSR, we were in this constant sense of tension. And what the Ukrainians are doing right now for us is degrading Russia's war-making capability conventionally. I mean, they still have the nuclear weapons, but their ability to make war in the neighborhood is being significantly degraded. I mean, both in terms of weapons and they're losing thousands of their soldiers in Ukraine. And if we don't stop it here, this thing spreads. I mean, it is like a disease. And I think that we have a lot at stake in trying to make sure that Ukraine has, and they want to do the fight. If they have the weaponry and the training and the intelligence and all the things that we can provide along with our allies. And if anything's come out of this that's a positive, you got Finland, Sweden now want to join NATO. NATO is united in a way I haven't seen in a really long time. Now, there are limits, I think, economically to what some of the NATO countries can do because they're so dependent upon Russian energy, which is another issue we need to solve with American energy. But, the fact that Finland, which has a great military, lots of assets, lots of weaponry, because they're right on the border there, wants to join NATO, I think is just further solidifies the West in this cause. And I think the other thing it does, it sends a message to Red China. Who is worried the most about Ukrainian success right now? China. And because they've kind of made their bed with the Russians, and the worst thing that can happen to their ambitions is to see the Russian army ground into the cold dirt in Ukraine. I think that is a good outcome for us all across the board. So yes, we wrote a check, and if you look at what we're spending and relative to what our NATO allies are spending, we're the biggest dog in the hunt, but they are all ponying up. And more of those NATO countries now are getting up to what NATO requires, which is 2% of your GDP to be spent on defense. A lot of them were under that. They're coming up to it. And as a percentage of their GDP, most of them are spending way more than we are on the effort. So the Reagan doctrine, when I was growing up, I saw this happen in Afghanistan, the late 1980s, and Nicaragua, was you support, enable, empower, arm the resistance against these major powers that are our adversaries. And pretty soon the Mujahideen had pushed Russia out of Afghanistan. We supported the Contras in Nicaragua. That was kind of a Reagan policy, which I think makes sense today as you look at this resurgent Russia, which is trying to fulfill the imperialistic ambitions that they've always had and that Putin, at least, is trying to rechannel.
Let's talk about China for a minute. We've seen in the last year or so people like the NBA or Disney very, very willing to criticize American policy or states for specific laws or things like that, but they are very quiet when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party and any kinds of human rights issues or anything that might upset their business interests in China. We've seen a lot of cyber threats. We see a lot of other activity going on. How concerned are you about the threat posed by China, and what do you think Congress can do about that?
Well, I'm very concerned, and I think we should be doing everything possible, mainly to make sure that we're making the right investments to protect the country. And a lot of that's in cyber. I mean, this is the new world, and the world that China is, particularly aggressive at on a daily basis. They're trying to hack into our electric grid, our financial system, and building up the firewalls and having the capability to be able to defend that, but also to be able to counterattack, I think is huge. And I think in that new world, yes, conventional weaponry is important, and everybody, the countries that are nuclear, that deterrent will always be there. But I think the cyber world is one of the fronts of modern warfare among the superpowers, or the powers at least that are near to us, that we're going to have to wage. So I think that we can't be doing enough to prepare for that. I think the other thing that we miss, and this is one thing, I don't understand this at all, but the Biden administration on trade has, in my view, just been missing in action. And we've had their representatives in front of our relevant committees. I've served on the Senate Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over trade. I'm on the Ag Committee, which also has some jurisdiction over trade, and Commerce, which also has. So I hear a lot from their representatives. The one thing I can't understand is they have no interest in negotiating free trade agreements. To negotiate or expedite free trade agreements, you have to request what's called trade promotion authority from Congress. And we actually gave it to President Obama. A Democrat president, Republicans in Congress voted to give them that authority to negotiate FTAs. They aren't negotiating any FTAs. They haven't requested trade promotion authority. And I look at that region around in the Indo-Pacific, and I look what China's doing. They're very strategic. I mean, they're just picking up islands. They're setting up bases. They're drawing all these countries into their economic orbit. And these are all countries that would more naturally be aligned with us. But because we're not present, and they are, we're losing out. So every one of those countries in that region, because the Australians are worried, the New Zealand is worried, and then you look at the Singapores and the Thailands and the Vietnams and all these countries that we ought to be doing business with, we ought to be present there. And they just have had no interest. They announced this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was a meaningless document that has no market access, that provides no incentive for these countries to want to do business with the United States, and no interest in doing free trade agreements. And I just find that, I don't understand it, because I think one of the ways to check China from a national security standpoint is to be peeling off their economic partners and using our economic power and might as a weapon, as a check against them. And we're not doing that. So I think there are all the different levers of power that you can pull: military, economic, political, diplomatic, all those sorts of things. With China, you just have to understand that what their ambitions are, they are big. And I talk to any country around the world where you travel, and particularly places like Africa. China's everywhere. They're in the southern hemisphere. They're on the continent of Africa. They are investing in infrastructure projects, and then when those infrastructure projects go belly up, they take over the infrastructure. They're very strategic, and I just think that we are kind of sort of hit and miss in terms of the strategy that we have. But first and foremost, we've got to protect the country, and I think the cyber world is going to be a real key to that.
We're getting down to the last few minutes of our time, and so I don't really want to relitigate the 2020 election, but I do want to look ahead at the next election and the one after that.
Oh, please.
You really want to go back and talk about January 6th? I know the January 6th Commission is active, and we're all watching it, but not telling the pollsters that we are. And but I want to talk about the Electoral Contact in particular, because we heard some talk about that, thought there was some motion on that. Trying to figure out if there's some way to make sure that the rules are updated from 1887.
Yeah.
Is that thing still alive? Is there still some motion to do something about that?
There actually is. As long as it's a narrow solution, which addresses the Electoral Contact and doesn't incorporate the rest of their agenda. Because the Democrats tried to blow up the filibuster earlier this year to try and get their election agenda through, which consisted of basically federalizing, nationalizing elections in this country and doing away with a lot of the state, for example, in South Dakota, we have voter ID, photo ID, I should say, to vote. And under, their regime, you would kill that idea, and it would pull all the levers of power when it comes to running elections in this country into the federal government. And I can't imagine, if people don't trust elections today, how they're going to trust them anymore if the federal government is running them. So, but I do think on the Electoral Count Act, there will be a legislative solution that comes forward that is specific to that issue. And if you look at the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, the 12th Amendment, and the Electoral Count Act, I mean, it's pretty clear what the role of Congress, to me at least, and the Vice President are in our elections. But because there was an issue raised, and the only way that Congress would ever get involved is if there was a dispute. And the reason the Electoral Count Act was passed in 1887 is because in 1877, after the 76 election, coming out of Reconstruction, there were southern states that submitted 2 slates of electors. And so they didn't know what to do with it, and how are you going to decide which one's the valid one, which one's the legitimate one? And so the Electoral Count Act was passed. And essentially, the only way in which Congress would have a role, our job basically is ministerial. Constitutionally, under the 12th Amendment, when the electors, the slates come in from the states, they're opened up in front and counted in front of Congress. That's it. That's it, which is why I didn't see any role for us in it, because there weren't any disputes. The states all certified their electors on time in accordance with the law after the 2020 election. But because there was a question raised about that, and because there was a question raised about the role of the Vice President, I think it's important to slam the door shut and make that unequivocally clear. And so I think you will see a proposal, and who knows, hopefully it won't be controversial, because to me it shouldn't be, but it could be because of the politics of the time we're in. But basically, to just clarify, this is what the role of the Vice President is. And to his credit, Mike Pence understood that. And he got legal opinions leading up to it, and despite all the pressure that he got, he stood firm and understood what that role was, because there were lots of backdoor ways people were trying to get a different outcome. And they were trying to use Congress, use the Vice President and their roles, which to me, again, are very clearly defined in the Constitution and in the 12th Amendment, and in the Electoral Count Act, but